The revolutionary discovery. In a quiet study in Switzerland in 1939, Carl Jung sat writing, unaware that his words would shake the foundations of Western thought. After decades of working with the human mind, he had stumbled upon an ancient truth, one that seemed impossible, even absurd. A 2,500-year-old teaching of the Buddha suggested that the very thing Jung had spent his life studying, the self, might not exist at all. But Jung wasn't deterred. Instead, he was fascinated. He wrote that Buddhism was the most sensible and most direct of all religions. Why would a giant of Western psychology, a man who devoted his career to understanding the self, find so much wisdom in a teaching that denied it? What happens when these two powerful perspectives collide? The answer reveals something profound, something that can change how we see ourselves and the world around us. Two moments that changed everything. To understand this paradox, we need to go back, first, to a quiet grove in ancient India. There, beneath the Bodhi tree, a prince-turned-monk named Siddhartha Gautama sat in deep meditation. After years of searching, he finally saw the truth. Our sense of a fixed, unchanging self is an illusion. This insight became one of the core teachings of Buddhism. Now, fast forward to the early 20th century. Carl Jung, already famous for his groundbreaking work on the human psyche, sits in his study, surrounded by ancient texts from the East. He is developing his theory of the self, an idea that seems to contradict everything the Buddha discovered. According to Jung, the self is the key to psychological wholeness. Two perspectives, seemingly in opposition. And yet, both work. Both have helped countless people find peace, healing, and meaning in their lives. How can this be? To answer that, we need to explore the worlds that shaped these two thinkers. A bridge between two worlds. The 19th century was a time of radical change. In the bustling streets of Germany, a philosopher named Arthur Schopenhauer introduced Buddhist ideas to Western thinkers. Among those he influenced was a young Carl Jung, who would later write that Schopenhauer was the first to truly open his eyes to the suffering of the world. But Jung's real turning point came in 1909, when he met Richard Wilhelm, a renowned translator of Chinese classics. Through Wilhelm, Jung gained access to Eastern philosophical texts that transformed his understanding of the human mind. From 1909 to 1914, he immersed himself in Sanskrit studies, spending hours each day deciphering ancient Buddhist wisdom. By 1920, his personal library contained one of the largest collections of Buddhist texts in Europe. Yet Jung wasn't just reading, he was discovering patterns in his own patients' experiences that mirrored Buddhist insights. Again and again, he saw the same truth. Suffering arises from attachment to a fixed sense of self. But whereas the Buddha taught meditation as the path to liberation, Jung used psychoanalysis, different methods, but the same deep exploration of the mind. Jung's quest for the self. Jung's idea of the self wasn't just about ego or identity. In his book Ion, 1951, he described it as something vast, something that included both the conscious and the unconscious, the seen and the unseen. He discovered that buried beneath our everyday awareness lay powerful universal patterns, archetypes that appeared across cultures and time. His patients, even those with no knowledge of Eastern traditions, would dream of mandalas, circular symbols of wholeness found in Buddhist art. One businessman dreamed of a glowing crystal at the bottom of a well, an image Jung recognized as strikingly similar to Buddhist depictions of enlightenment. Jung saw the journey toward the self as a process, not a fixed state. He called it individuation, the path of integrating all aspects of our psyche, both light and shadow, into a whole. This journey, he found, often led his patients to experiences that mirrored Buddhist enlightenment. But how does this apply to everyday life? Think about moments when you felt lost, when the person you thought you were no longer made sense. Maybe it was after a breakup, a job loss, or a major life transition. In these moments, our old sense of self shatters, forcing us to confront the unknown. Jung believed this was an opportunity, a chance to integrate deeper aspects of ourselves rather than cling to an identity that no longer serves us. Buddha's path to no self Meanwhile, the Buddha taught a path in the opposite direction. Instead of integrating a self, he encouraged people to look deeply and realize that no permanent self could be found. In ancient India, the dominant belief was in an eternal soul, or Atman. The Buddha, through direct experience, saw that this wasn't true. He broke down human experience into 5 constantly changing components: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. None of these alone, or even together, made up a fixed self. To explain this, he used simple examples. Imagine a chariot. If you take it apart, its wheels, axle, body, where is the chariot? It turns out, chariot is just a convenient label for these parts working together. The same is true of what we call self. It's just a label for shifting thoughts, emotions, and sensations. This idea might sound abstract, but consider a real-life example. Think about social media. Many of us curate an online persona, a version of ourselves that we present to the world. But is that really you? And if you act differently with friends, family, or co-workers, which version is real? The Buddhist view suggests that none of them are. Rather than trying to define a single, true self, we can learn to embrace change and fluidity. 2 paths, 1 truth. So, are Jung and the Buddha saying opposite things? Not quite. Jung's self and the Buddha's no-self might seem like contradictions, but in reality, they complement each other. Jung focused on wholeness, on bringing the unconscious into consciousness so that we can live fully. The Buddha focused on freedom, on letting go of our rigid sense of self so we can experience life directly. Both perspectives offer profound insights. Jung's work helps us understand our inner world, while Buddhist teachings help us move beyond it. And when we bring them together, we find a deeper truth, one that can transform not just how we think, but how we live. So, what can we take away from this? Next time you feel lost, anxious, or uncertain about who you are, remember, you don't need to cling to a fixed identity. Growth comes from integrating your experiences, as Jung suggested. Peace comes from letting go of attachment, as the Buddha taught. The balance of these 2 ideas can lead to a life that is both deeply meaningful and profoundly free. Young Buddha Zen masters ask, "What was your original face before your parents were born?" Tibetan practitioners contemplate, "Who is it that thinks?" These questions aren't meant to be answered in words, but to lead us beyond our usual understanding of self. The Buddha himself taught that this isn't just philosophy. It's the key to ending suffering. When we let go of the idea of a fixed identity, something profound happens. We stop grasping at life, trying to control or resist what comes. Instead, we allow experience to flow naturally. The illusion of a solid, unchanging self is what causes suffering. Without it, we engage with life more freely, with compassion, and without fear. Chapter 4. The Hidden Connection. At first, Jung's idea of the self and Buddhism's teaching of no self seem contradictory. Jung saw the self as the source of wholeness, while the Buddha taught that the self is an illusion. But looking deeper, we see that they are not so different after all. Jung noticed something fascinating in his patients. As they moved towards self-realization, their rigid sense of identity dissolved. He wrote in 1938, "The experience of the self brings a dissolution of the identity we've always taken for granted." In other words, the more we become ourselves, the more we see that the self isn't what we thought it was. The Buddha taught the same thing from a different angle. He didn't say we don't exist, but that our usual sense of self is a false construction, one that keeps us trapped in suffering. Both perspectives point to the same truth. Freedom doesn't come from reinforcing our identity, but from letting go of it. Take, for example, an artist who defines themselves solely by their craft. If their art is rejected, they might feel like they themselves have failed. But what if they saw their creativity as something that flows through them, rather than being who they are? This shift in perspective can be life-changing. It allows them to continue creating without being paralyzed by self-doubt. Jung was deeply influenced by Buddhism. He studied the Tibetan Book of the Dead and saw how its description of consciousness dissolving into clear light mirrored his patient's experiences of ego dissolution. He even described a similar state himself in the Red Book, calling it the pleroma, a place beyond all distinctions. Both Jung and the Buddha recognize that suffering comes from clinging to an identity that isn't real. Buddhism calls this attachment. Jung called it resistance to the unconscious. Both paths lead to transformation, not by building a stronger ego, but by letting go of the illusion that we are only our ego. Chapter 5. Freedom in Practice. This isn't just theory. Bringing Jung and Buddhism together creates powerful tools for real-life transformation. Many therapists now integrate both perspectives to help people heal. One therapist described a patient, Sarah, who spent years trying to fix herself. But when she stopped trying so hard and simply observed her experience, her anxiety began to dissolve. In that moment, she discovered what Jung called the self and what Buddhism calls no self, not by searching, but by surrendering. Think about your own life. How often do you define yourself by a single role? Your job, your relationship, your past mistakes? What happens if you loosen your grip on that identity? It doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop suffering when those things change, as they inevitably will. Dream work is another example. Jung taught that dreams reveal hidden parts of ourselves. When combined with Buddhist mindfulness, dream interpretation becomes even deeper. Instead of getting caught up in the stories our dreams tell, we learn to observe them with spacious awareness. Imagine someone who frequently dreams of being chased. Instead of panicking or dismissing it, they could sit with that fear, asking, "What part of me is running? What am I avoiding in my waking life?" This kind of introspection can lead to profound breakthroughs. Then there's shadow work, the practice of facing the parts of ourselves we usually reject. Jung believed integrating our shadow was key to healing. Buddhism teaches the same through meditation. Instead of fighting our difficult emotions, we allow them to be. One psychiatrist put it simply, when we stop fighting ourselves, integration happens naturally. Even in relationships, this understanding brings transformation. Couples who grasp the fluid nature of self stop fighting over who's right and start connecting on a deeper level. One therapist observed, partners who understand Jung and the Buddha fight less and love more. This wisdom is even changing leadership. Executives trained in these principles lead with both strength and humility. One CEO said, "Understanding the self as both center and no center made me a better leader, more effective, yet less attached to my ego." Think of a workplace where leaders operate with this mindset. Instead of rigid hierarchy and ego battles, there's a sense of collaboration and flow. Problems are approached with curiosity rather than defensiveness. Decisions are made from a place of wisdom, not fear. The universal truth. At first, Jung and the Buddha seem to be speaking different languages, but in the end, they are pointing to the same truth. Jung wrote, "The goal of Eastern practice is the same as Western psychology, the shift from ego to self." The Buddha expressed the same idea. Like a water bubble, like a mirage, one who sees the world this way, death does not find. Our suffering doesn't come from having or not having a self. It comes from how we relate to our experience. Jung called the solution wholeness. The Buddha called it liberation. Both lead us beyond illusion to true freedom. So now, I leave you with this question. What lies beyond the story you tell yourself about who you are? Think about it as you go about your day. What happens if you stop clinging to a fixed identity and simply allow yourself to be? Let's explore this together. Share your thoughts in the comments. What resonated with you? What challenged you? And if you haven't already, join our journey by subscribing. Until next time, may your path be filled with clarity, courage, and compassion.